Wow, well, everything is shut there.
Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm Director of the Institute for Policy Research at the University of Bath. And for those of you just joining us this afternoon, welcome to this conference. Is it time for universal basic income? This morning, we debated particularly the kind of wider picture of the macroeconomy, of what's happening to our welfare state, social security systems, and in particular in the last panel session, debates about monetary and fiscal policy, how they work together now, the importance of fiscal policy, and the relationship between fiscal policy and not just demand in the economy, but also the distribution of income, and in particular to households that need income support in the current crisis. And that started to get us into debates about the feasibility and desirability of basic income as opposed to other forms of welfare state provision, existing welfare states, and whether they should be strengthened and reformed in light of the crisis, or whether we should move to something like a basic income. And we're going to address those sorts of questions in this coming panel session. This session is going to be chaired by Emma Dawnay. Emma, who is a political economist, a core member of the think tank Greenhouse, and a board member of Modernising Money, the NGO in Switzerland that brought about the national referendum there on basic income, and also a very active member of the Green Party. And she's joined by some brilliant guests. I'll leave it to Emma to do more introductions, but Carys Roberts from IPPR, Alfie Sterling from the New Economics Foundation, Jane Gingrich, a political economist, works particularly on welfare states and social policy at the University of Oxford, and Anke Hassel, Professor Anke Hassel from the Hertie School in Berlin. Welcome, Anke, all the way from Berlin. Again, political economist working on questions of the welfare state and the political economy of welfare states. A great panel. And we're going to look, as I say, at these questions about the relationship with the current crisis, how welfare states have responded to that crisis, what kinds of reforms we need, and the sort of politics of those reforms. Where do electoral and other coalitions come from to support some of the changes that people might want to see and advocate for? After this panel, we're going to go into a pre-recorded discussion that I did earlier in the week with Professor Ollie Kangas. Ollie Kangas was the person who led the team that designed and implemented and then evaluated the basic income experiment in Finland. And so Ollie's talking about that, what was learned from that experiment, what the issues were when they tried to design it, what resources they had, and how they've gone about evaluating it. So after this session is finished, stay on the line and watch the debate, and you can then hear from Ollie Kangas, and then we'll go into the rest of the afternoon. I just have to say a quick reminder that if you're using social media, please do use the hashtag UBI conference. If you have any questions or any comments, there's a ask a question button at the bottom there. It's got 3 on it at the moment, and there's a chat function down the side. So please use that too, and we'll do our best to respond to you during the day. I'm very pleased to see nearly 500 of you tuning in, which is great. You've got an excellent panel coming up, and with that, I'm going to hand over to Emma to chair the session. Emma.
Thank you, Nick. Well, it's great to be here, and I must say, sort of, thank you so much for everybody who's organising the sort of Bristol Festival of Ideas, and also, this conference. And we've had some really interesting sessions this morning. I believe that if you didn't catch them, you can view them again very easily, so that you can catch them later, and I thoroughly recommend them. So first, before we get into it, just a little bit of housekeeping. So I'll ask each panelist to give a 10-minute introduction, and I'll give them a 2-minute warning. And then after they've all spoken, we'll then do a question session when you can put questions to the panelists. In fact, at any time, you can click on the questions and answers box and write your questions there. And it's very helpful for me if you then upvote questions that you find particularly good and you'd like to hear answers to. And of course, do add into the chat box, and that is great to see, sort of, when lots of people are having a chat and we see that what we're doing is sort of creating lots of interest. So do add things into the chat box at any time. So I think without more ado, we'll get started. So first, I'd like to welcome Carys Roberts to speak. Carys is the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Policy Research, IPPR, having previously been their Chief Economist. And she was the key contributor to the Commission on Economic Justice, and I can recommend the report Prosperity and Justice if you haven't looked at it already. It's yeah, really interesting. So over to you, Carys.
Thank you very much, Emma, and also just to repeat, thanks to the organisers of the event. It's fantastic to see so many people on here to talk about UBI and all the kind of surrounding policy issues. I'm very pleased to be part of such a great lineup. So we don't have long to talk about a huge number of issues. I think what I wanted to start on and focus on initially is the question of what the crises that have occurred over the past 10 years, or just over 10 years, the financial crisis, and now the pandemic, tell us about our welfare system and how it needs to adapt. So most people on the call would be familiar with some of the things that have happened over the past 10, 12 years. But of course, the financial crisis caused several changes in our welfare system, in particular, making it less generous through austerity, and also a focus on work incentives and encouraging people into work. That was accompanied by, and it's of course debated about the relationship with this, but accompanied by an increase in insecure work that we saw over the past decade. Now, of course, going into a pandemic, that is not a particularly great situation to be in, with up to 1 million people on zero-hour contracts, for example, a huge increase in the self-employed, much of that not through choice, and that has left us particularly unresilient to certain threats that the pandemic's presented. I think there are a few key concepts I wanted to pull out that I think those twin crises have taught us about the welfare system. The first is that this narrative of strivers v scroungers is just not applicable to what the welfare system actually does, or the realities of our labour market. And this was a narrative that was particularly strengthened through the 2000s, as well as by the coalition government. And I think that's really been called into question through the realities of millions of people facing the loss of their job through this pandemic. So that I think is a positive thing, that the pandemic has revealed to many people something about the narratives of our welfare system that wasn't there before. The second is the idea that any work is good work. So after the financial crisis, people were encouraged to take up any job, and conditionality in the welfare system enabled that. I think what we've seen is that did not result in good jobs or well-paid jobs. And consequently, the idea that we should be pushing people into any old job is pretty outdated. And as we face a mass unemployment crisis, one that we haven't faced for some time, I think that's a particularly relevant learning. Third, I think the most recent crisis has shown people that actually the amounts of money that we expect people to live on are inadequate, are grossly inadequate to live a dignified life. And as such, I think that there will be a shift in public opinion with so many more people going onto the welfare system, and that's expected to be in the millions in terms of job losses. We've done some analysis on this recently. And I think there could well be a shift in how people see our social safety net and whether it is adequate. And then the fourth, I think, is that the role of caring and carers in our society has really come to the fore. And again, there will be many more people who have had experience of needing to combine care and work, whether that's for children or whether it's for the sick, and so on. And so I think there will be a shift in terms of how people view care work, with interesting implications for our welfare system. So I think going forwards, we have to think about the future crises coming down the track. And many of these are only deepening. So the fact that we have increasing care needs, potentially as people live longer, and in ill health, potentially automation, even if it doesn't create the disappearance of jobs, could create rapid churn, similar to what we're seeing at the moment. And then climate risk in particular, so catastrophic climate events could leave us in similar situations to what we have now in terms of people not being able to work, potentially being left without homes. For instance, flooding could create those risks and already is creating those risks. And so I think it's a really pivotal moment for us to be thinking about the welfare system, what we've learned from the previous two crises, and making sure that we're prepared for the next crisis, and the next crises, because there will be more than one. So what sort of system does that lead you towards? Well, I think it's clear that we need to radically reduce conditionality in the welfare system. It is not creating dignity. It is failing to get people into work that suits their skills and suits their needs. And as such, I think that whatever system follows on from it will need to reduce that the conditionality requirements. I think it's clear that the purpose of the welfare system in terms of risk pooling needs to be paid attention to. Essentially, the exam question of the last 10, 15 years has been how can the welfare system get more people into work? I'm not saying that's the right exam question, but it has been the one that policymakers have turned to in recent years. And instead, I think there needs to be a renewed focus, and I hope there will be a renewed focus on how we can pool risk collectively and have a system that protects everybody. I think that's where you could see the shift in politics. I also think we need a system that recognises the different realities of people's lives. So whether that's where they have caring responsibilities, a disability, they have a family, and also different levels of resources with which to approach this. What we've seen in this crisis is that some people have been much better able to weather the storm than others, and some have gained, whereas others have lost. And so I think that's an important principle for any response going forwards. Now, UBI is one way in which we could address some of those challenges. I do think, however, that there are other ways you could also do it that might require commanding less resource and being able to use that potentially more effectively. So whether that's the minimum income guarantee idea, which we've worked on, and Alfie has worked on extensively as well, or whether it's increasing collective provision of services that we all rely on, such as social care or childcare. I think there are multiple ways in which we could address these key challenges going forward, and there are still some kind of big remaining questions around UBI that I would want to see answered before we went for that option. And I know I need to wrap up soon, so I'll summarise those briefly and look forward to discussing them in the discussion. But I think the two key ones for me are, one, if we are going to commit that level of resource, how do we make sure that we don't have to let go of actually really efficient, really effective collective ways of providing things? Could it lead to a more individualized system? And then the second is that if we need to find that much resource, and there are often visions of automation and people not working and instead getting a UBI, then we need to find a way to get that wealth, for instance, from the big tech companies. And A, that's difficult, we haven't worked out how to do it yet. And B, I'm not sure that we want society to be in debt to those big tech companies. The political economy of that I find quite worrying. So that's a hugely rushed discussion of those issues, and I'd really look forward to discussing them. But I think those are the key questions that I think any reform of the welfare system and any assessment of UBI is the best option for that would need to answer.
Thank you, Carys. That was a really good introduction, and I think you managed to cover so many of the important questions that are sort of are feeding into this. That's and I've got lots of questions bubbling in my head, but I'll wait until the end. So please do add your questions into the question box. Now I'd like to introduce Alfie Sterling. So Alfie is the head of economics at the New Economics Foundation, and he leads their work on fiscal policy, monetary policy, and social security reform. And he's also published in the areas of finance, labour market reform, industrial strategy, and family policy. You can also hear him quite often speaking on the radio on these subjects. So over to you, Alfie.
Many thanks, Emma, and thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Am I coming through? Many thanks,
yes.
Emma, for having me. I'll just add a few thoughts. I agree with a lot of what Carys said. I'm really keen to hear from our panelists and get into a discussion, but I'll add a few thoughts, both on the kind of the immediate context for macroeconomics right now, the immediate context of the labour market where we find it, and for social security, and of course in the UK that's predominantly universal credit, and then a few thoughts on the debate around universal basic income in particular. So in terms of the wider macroeconomic context, and I believe this has been discussed at length this morning, so hopefully this is just recapping and not contradicting what's already been said, but I do believe we're in a moment of really quite profound shift in macroeconomic policy, and this is even more profound than the one we saw following 2008, where we saw quite a lot of experimentation in macro, with quantitative easing being the prime example, but also other interventions like the term funding scheme, where effectively the Bank of England was trying to get around this problem of interest rates reaching their effective floor. This time around, we are well and truly at that effective floor, and it's not just constraining conventional monetary policy, it's also constraining many of the new experiments that were developed after 2008. Quantitative easing, for example, has now also reached its floor. It can't push back down long-term interest rates in the market any further than they're already at. And what does that all mean for this debate? Well, it means that fiscal policy is incredibly important. It is now the predominant lever for policymakers to pull in order to provide support for the economy. Indeed, central banks have actually now implicitly shifted their stance. They're no longer trying to stimulate the economy directly. They are now effectively trying to just provide space for government to borrow in order to be able to support the economy directly. And that means there are also very few meaningful constraints on government borrowing at the moment. In terms of the immediate labour market context, so in the UK, if we look at where things are currently at as of end of summer, it looks like we have up to about 3 million jobs that are at severe risk of being lost to the economy. Obviously, the future is contingent on the spread of the virus, on further support that might come in. But if you look at hours lost in the labour market and turnover of companies in September, we're seeing about 10 to 15% of jobs at high risk. And these are in many of the places that Carys mentioned. So it's particular sectors, hospitality, domestic tourism, but it's also affecting workers that have insecure employment contracts, whether that's 0 hours or fixed term. And this is something that's predominated for the last 10 years. So our labour market has adjusted and shifted in a way in the last 10 years that has made us particularly ill prepared for this current crisis, at least from the point of view of workers. In terms of the predominant government policy response to this labour market challenge, the job support scheme will be replacing the furlough scheme at the end of this month. And work at IPPR, but also at New Economics Foundation, where I work, has shown that unfortunately the job support scheme is a very poor younger brother to the full furlough scheme. It's likely to only be equipped to protect a few 100,000 jobs out of that 3 million, rather than the millions that furlough is equipped to protect. I should say though that the overall objective here in the labour market is not just about protecting jobs. No one believes that in 12 months' time our economy will look the same as it did 12 months ago. It has to be a blend of job protection, but also providing provision, funded training for workers to move to new jobs. But then, of course, critically creating those new jobs for people to move into. And I'd speak to many of the things that Carys spoke to as well, in terms of we need to really emphasise jobs in zero carbon infrastructure, whether that's insulating homes, but also in low carbon jobs in terms of social infrastructure as well, strengthening our social care system, for example, and public health. But against that wider backdrop of macroeconomic and labour market context, there's a really vital role for social security. And I'd say it has two predominant features. One is income protection, out with someone's ability to work, and that's crucial not only from the immediate point of view of financial distress, alleviating poverty and the misery that will cause for millions of people in this country if it's not, if reform of social security is not put in place. But it's also vital actually for the recovery as well, both in terms of providing spending in the economy as an automatic stabilizer. It maintains that spending in the economy despite the fact that jobs are being lost, but also moving forwards, it ensures that demand for jobs is there and is such that people are not looking for the worst job that comes along, the first and worst job that comes along, but have some discretion as they re-enter the labour market, as we're thinking about creating those new jobs, particularly in care, for example, where pay and conditions are actually quite low. Having a strong social security system will put pressure on employers to pay workers properly as well. So then just reflecting then on the UK's current social security system and how it might fare against these challenges, probably the single most important thing to emphasise about universal credit is its lack of adequate provision. So the level of support, the generosity of the payment is incredibly low. It's historically low to looking at the UK across time. So in the 1960s, unemployment benefit for a single adult would replace about 33% of average earnings. Today, it's a little over 15%. And even that is only because of the temporary top-up, which expires in March. Without that top-up, it's about 14%. But we have a comparatively ungenerous system compared to other advanced economies. The UK has the fourth least generous social security system in the OECD overall. And of course, this is linked to the response to the last crisis in two ways. One is that social security reform and cuts to social security took the brunt, alongside certain department spending, took the brunt of austerity following 2008 as government sought to pull back the public realm as debt expanded, and social security and universal credit took the real brunt of that. But also we saw a shift in the last 10 years from welfare from government in cash transfers to welfare through the tax system, so tax allowances, with the most classic example being the increase in the personal allowance of income tax, far more regressive than simple cash transfers through social security, because of course tax allowances don't reach those that aren't in work. Because of perverse nature of our tax system as well, it ends up actually giving more to those on high earners as well. So what's the answer in terms of the direction of travel for reform? Well, I think there are two key features that I think are crucial. One is strengthening the adequacy of our social security system, the generosity of those payments, and the other is about protecting financial incentives to work and really focusing on what we call effective tax rates for those moving from unemployment into work. And that's both a combination of the tax system itself, but also allowing people to keep more of what they earn and not deducting benefits so quickly. Is there a role for universal basic income within this? I would argue that universalism in and of itself is really important. It's important to be part of the mix. The advantages of at least some element of a universal payment include things like the speed at which you can reach people's bank accounts. If you set up a universal payment, you can then top it up very quickly in a crisis. It reduces stigma, of course, and you have a wider collective buy-in into social security. It also means you can have at least some payment that is protected from things like the 5-week wait on universal credit or any system of means testing, which requires to assess people's means. If you have a payment that is protected throughout the journey from unemployment, from work into unemployment and back again, it will help the efficiency of the system. But I don't think you can achieve all the objectives through a UBI alone. I think that as you then try to solve more problems by increasing the value of that universal payment, you tend to see diminishing returns. So if you're trying to solve everything, if you're trying to solve all poverty, for example, for a UBI, it often becomes prohibitively expensive. And actually, by prohibitively expensive, I don't mean that the money doesn't exist to do this stuff. I mean that there are other ways of using those resources more efficiently. And Carys again spoke to some of these, whether that's means testing or provision of services in kind, for example, through free childcare provision. So to wrap up, at the New Economics Foundation, we're proposing a blended system of reform for social security, which does have this universal payment sitting at its core, but with a means tested top up. For us, a key objective is, can we get our safety net to hit a much closer level of generosity to the minimum income standard? So that's a standard that's assessed for a methodology led by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which shows us what is the minimum amount it requires for a family or an individual to live on. And that's important, of course, not just from the poverty point of view, but also for aggregate demand, also for improving the demand for good jobs. And the second objective is, can we get those effective tax rates down as well? And so for us, there are two elements to the proposal. One is, if we scrap the personal allowance of income tax, currently about 130 billion in foregone tax revenue is spent on that tax allowance, and instead pay it to everyone in cash, what you'll see is a redistribution from those in about the top 12-13% who actually benefit disproportionately from that tax allowance, being redistributed to those out of work, because those out of work don't currently benefit from that tax allowance at all. And it means everyone will receive a payment, essentially universal and unconditional, of about £50 a week. On top of that payment, we would then layer substantial reform to universal credit, effectively replacing universal credit with a new system, with particular attention to raising the level of generosity of the main payments, the adult payment and the child payment, to get closer to that minimum income standard, but also really pushing down on what's known as the taper rate and increasing work allowances, which affects how much benefits are withdrawn as people earn more. And we've shown how the combination of this, swapping the personal allowance for a cash payment, and investing in universal credit at a cost of about £15 billion a year, so much less than other schemes that have been set up, such as the furlough scheme, would allow you to achieve those objectives, to get much closer to minimum income standard level, but also improve financial work incentives so they are stronger than they are in the current system. I'll leave that there, but really looking forward to questions on any of the above.
Thank you, Alfie. Yes. No, really interesting to hear all of that, and yeah, how the social security system is working, or rather isn't working at the moment. Yeah, I'm also looking forward to the questions. But for now, I'd like to move on to introduce Professor Anke Hassel. Anke is Professor of Public Policy at the Hertie School. She was previously the Scientific Director at the Institute of Economic and Social Research at the Hans Buchler Foundation, where she's worked on labour markets, social partnerships, co-determination. She was also an expert in the fact-finding committee on growth, prosperity and quality of life in the German Bundestag. So Anke, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I've got a couple of slides, and if I can, I would share them with you. But I'm not sure it's working. I'm trying to share my screen.
Did you find, yeah, there should be a button here.
It's working on sharing the screen, but it's not coming up. Okay. So while we're waiting on sharing the screen, so what I had prepared was really a more empirical overview of what we know about UBI, Universal Basic Income, what the political discussions are around it, who supports it, and what experiments have been carried out in various countries. But as I listened to Carey and Alfie, I realized this discussion here is not so much about universal basic income, because we did not really touch upon it, but it's really much more about social security system and the capacities of the welfare state and universal assistance, and how universal the welfare state should actually be, and how generous and how supportive it should be. And my experience with working on various aspects of UBI, because it's also a discussion within in Germany, but my experience is really that the increasing trend towards the UBI shows the weakness of the current welfare states within advanced industrial countries. And what we also see is that the support for a universal basic income is stronger in those countries where people have the impression that the welfare state is actually broken and it's not working anymore. So if we do have a couple of surveys For instance, in the European Social Survey, there's a question, do you support the introduction of a universal basic income? And there we can see that the UK is actually quite in the middle. About 50% of people who were asked and surveyed would say, yes, we support a UBI, introduction of a UBI. And it is stronger, first of all, it's stronger in Eastern Europe, it's stronger in most of the post-socialist countries. And the support is weaker in those countries where we see a much more generous, a much more supportive welfare state, for instance, in the Scandinavian countries, but also Switzerland, but also Germany. In Germany, the support for a universal basic income is less than in other more liberal countries. So I do think it is a response, and it is a response to a broken system. And the broken system is partly to do with the welfare state, so social insurance and protection of incomes, but it is also a response to a broken labor market and the increasing insecurity in the labor market and the rise in insecure and precarious employment. And if we look back on sort of where does that come from, the rise in insecure and precarious employment, that obviously has to do with many labor market reforms which we have seen over the last 20 to 25 years in many OECD countries, where employment protection was reduced, labor markets were deregulated, made more flexible, and it has become much harder to find secure employment and well-paid employment, to the extent that if you now look at expert reports, also by the OECD, for instance, their new job strategy that was published that was published last year in 2019, even the OECD is now talking about social inclusion as a major goal when it comes to reforming the labor market and aspirations in labor market policy, and social equality and the reduction of precarious work. So even there, the discussion is really about how can we create more good quality jobs, high quality jobs, and how can we decrease labor market insecurities and income insecurities. So, and all of this has less to do with UBI, because the discussion very often about a universal income is really detached from many other discussions we have on labor market reforms and reforms of social insurance and social security systems. And if we look at those countries where we have seen experiments with UBI, and that is the example of Finland, I will not say much about Finland because you will have a discussion with Olli Kangas, who was in charge of the Finnish experiment. But we have Finland, but we also have Ontario. Ontario had a basic income pilot studies, but we also have Barcelona had a similar exercise, and Utrecht has a similar exercise. So you find at a local level, we have a number of countries that have experimented with the introduction of a UBI. And very often this introduction of UBI meant actually that you had a flat fee that was paid to a particular chosen groups. And these experiments, these chosen groups were either low-paid workers, as in the example of Ontario, or you paid a flat rate to the unemployed, such as in Finland. Finland picked 2,000 unemployed workers, and they received an income of 560 euros a month, which was about 25% of median pay. And the idea behind these experiments is really to see what happens, how do people's life change after you introduce such an income? How does behavior of people change? Is there more job search going on, or do people withdraw from the labor market as soon as they have an income which is not conditioned and sanctioned if it's not accompanied by job search activities? So, and what we see around these experiments, we see a lot of research, because these are really experiments to find out what's happening if you introduce such a basic income. And these experiments also build on older experiments, which we have seen in the United States, for instance, with a negative income tax in the 1970s. So there were a number of states like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Iowa, etc., in the 1970s, where there were similar experiments with negative income tax. And the reason why I mention all these experiments is really that we know something about what happens if you have a universal basic income, and we know pretty well what the positive effects are and what the negative effects are. And the positive effects, which we find in almost all the studies, is that we do have positive effects on education. So people stay longer in education in those experiments where you have introduced a basic income. You have fewer dropouts from school. You have better nutrition rates. You also have better health. So people looked at, how has sickness changed? How has hospital admission rates changed after the introduction of a UBI? For instance, in those area where we had a negative income tax. We also see an effect on families. There are fewer divorce rates and there was less domestic violence. So there's a clear positive effect if you give people an income, a steady income, but also a decent income, which helps them. But you can also see negative effects. And the negative effects is that you do have a reduction in working hours. You have less of a participation in the labor market. People reduce their working time. And the second negative effect is obviously it's very costly. So you do have a direct cost effect. And that is the second point I want to make about the basic income is really the financial effect, which hasn't been solved yet. So in none of the experiments, there was a long-term financial plan. In none of the experiments, there was a clear perspective of how could one roll out these experiments on a national scale. All these experiments are very small in scale, like in the old one in the 1970s, when we look at the different states, these covered populations of about between 1,000 and 5,000 people in these states. But also in Finland, we had 2,000 people covered. In Ontario, we had 4,000 people covered. So these are really small-scale experiments. And even in these small-scale experiments, we run up into very high numbers very quickly and high costs very quickly. At the moment, there is an experiment just starting in the German context. And in the German context, we are looking at 1,500 people who will receive the basic income and 1,500 people for 2 years. And for these 1,500 people, we will already pay 5 million euros. So it is a large financial effort you have to make in order to fund the basic income. And that is, I think, the weakest point when we talk about it, because we cannot be sure if we introduce a universal basic income, how to fund it and who will be taxed in order to finance it. So when we look at the opinion polls of people, who support the basic income, there's always the caveat that you will receive a basic income, but it will be financed by taxation, but it's never said what kind of taxation will be introduced in order to fund it. And it's also not said what other kinds of benefits will be cut and will be not paid out anymore once you introduce a basic income. So we do not know basically what we will lose once we introduce more universal benefits. And it is not clear what is the effect on other kinds of benefits, such as state pensions, public pensions, but also other forms of social assistance and also, for instance, health expenditure, health insurance, etc. So the financing is really the weak point of a basic income. And I would really would like to stress that this point is important and we all really have to pay close attention to it. What does it mean if we have to pay out such a large number for a universal basic income? Where do we take the money from? And the suggestions on the table when we talk about financial transaction tax, when we talk about a CO2 emission tax, etc., I don't think that these proposals are very realistic, but my fear would be much more that as soon as we start paying out universal benefits, then the taxation will be levied on those who will receive these benefits, and then we will lose out a lot in terms of services when we discuss universal basic services. So there is a trade-off between a universal basic income and universal basic services, and I think the loser of this will be universal basic services, and we need to discuss this trade-off much more clearly if we are serious about introducing a basic income. And I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting, and also good to have a bit of the background of the experiments in universal basic income and the outcome of them. So I'd like to then move on to our final speaker. So I'd like to introduce Professor Jane Gingrich. Jane is a professor of political science at Oxford University, and her research interests involve comparative political economy and comparative social policy. And she's interested in the restructuring of the welfare state and the politics of institutional change. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I think I'm going to echo some of the comments that you've already heard. So I think to begin, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed in particularly glaring ways the inadequacy of the British social safety net. Already in the lead up to the pandemic, rates of poverty and income insecurity were high. Over the last decades, social benefits in the labor market have become increasingly both conditional and vulnerable to cuts. Reform to unemployment benefits already made under the Thatcher governments left an increasingly slim set of out-of-work direct benefits. The expansion of housing benefits and tax credits during the 2000s compensated in part for these weaknesses, but the decade of financial austerity and the consolidation of spending in the hyper-conditional and comparatively ungenerous universal credit has left many out. Indeed, the features that define the universal credit, its stringency, waiting periods, low levels of benefits, and monitoring and sanctioning regimes left those that lost work during the COVID crisis deeply vulnerable. But it also meant that those that maintained their jobs were vulnerable to insecure employment conditions, with little scope to speak up or organize collectively. The system of social protection then proved ill-suited to COVID. And I think in line with other panelists, I would agree that it's ill-suited to a fair and just society. In this environment, the UBI seems to offer a revitalization of the British welfare state, precisely because it promises the opposite of many of these pathologies. It's universal, not means tested. It's automatic and unconditional, not stringent and linked to work requirements. And rather than pushing workers into low-paid and often exploitative contracts, it gives them the possibility to say no. These aims are laudable, but in my few minutes here, I want to raise some questions about them. I think there's serious questions about how the UBI fits in as achieving what I would consider the desiderata of good policy, a fair distribution, compatibility with economic growth, and political sustainability. And secondly, I think some of the older and less glamorous social programs that we already know about, namely social insurance, well-funded and resourced social insurance programs actually perform better on most of these metrics. So given this is a panel on fiscal policy, I think I want to pick up on the question that Anke Hassel just spoke about, which is how do we pay for it? A full-scale UBI, which is genuinely universal, unconditional, and generous, would be extremely expensive, like over 15% of GDP at a minimum. And this raises serious questions about payment. Can we pay for the UBI in a way that is fair, compatible with growth, and politically sustainable? And I think there's four major approaches that have been advanced to paying for the UBI, and most serious plans combine these to some extent, but I'm going to just deal with them in turn. Wealth taxes, the expansion of the existing system of taxation, cutting or eliminating existing social welfare programs, or just reducing the cost of the UBI by taxing it back. So it's more conditional. So let's start with wealth taxes. This is favored by many advocates of the UBI on the left, and I think it has much to recommend it. Wealth concentration has increased enormously in recent decades, and concerns about automation and the future of work have raised a kind of nightmare scenario where there's concern that owners of capital will reap increasing rewards in the face of growth and leave others out. From this perspective, from the perspective of equity and equalizing social power, wealth taxes are extremely attractive. Moreover, taxes on the wealthy are popular. Voters regularly support them in surveys, and they allow a major expansion of spending without having to address hard questions about increasing taxes on the vast majority of voters. But I think the question is the state able to effectively tax the wealthy? The mobility of capital is often overstated. But where the wealthy have acquiesced to high taxes, it's often because it's part of a social contract that provides them with some benefits. Despite the popularity of the UBI among workers in tech companies and Silicon Valley, I'm just not convinced there's a grounding for a social contract between big tech and compensatory UBI payments. These companies rely on intensive human capital investment and infrastructure. And in this line, taxation for public research and development, education, housing, transport, and childcare are much more in line with supporting a productive model of growth through technology, and more likely to engender support rather than tax avoidance. By contrast, the UBI offers little, and in fact, the mobility of the wealthy in the face of high taxes is a potential concern. So in the United States, political scientist Jacob Hacker makes this point about Obamacare, which was funded in large part by taxes raised on the wealthy. This form of taxation made it possible to move the legislation forward. It was politically feasible because voters didn't immediately face a high levels of tax increase in order to pay for extended benefits. But it also has mobilized a deep and ongoing reaction that has made Obamacare and the entire Affordable Care Act increasingly vulnerable to backlash. So the purpose of this discussion is not to say that taxes on the wealthy are impossible because capital are mobile, or that all politics should be conciliatory towards the tax preferences of the rich. I think that would be a recipe for very meager and unimaginative social policy. However, the idea is that targeting resources largely from the wealthy alone to pay for the UBI is questionable. And some form of social accommodation between firms and the wealthy in tax systems and the types of underlying skills and support that the welfare state provides is necessary to create long-run sustainability. So the second way to think about raising taxes is just to use the existing tax system, raising the value-added tax or income taxes. So if you look at Andrew Yang, the failed candidate for the Democratic nomination for president in the US, he has a plan, or his plan for a UBI in the US was largely funded, or not largely, but in part funded by a new value-added tax. In Europe, this is less feasible since such taxes already exist. And so here we're looking at really raising existing taxes. And again, there may be some appetite to do this. There's a stylized finding from the history of European welfare states that people often support programs that they pay into and feel that they benefit from. So the question is then, would a UBI engender this type of reciprocity among taxpayers? And again, I really worry that it might not. The rise of conditionality did not come from nowhere politically. So conditionality is often politically popular. The programs that we've seen sort of globally that have some kind of political resilience and are highly generous do institutionalize and support expectations about reciprocity between work and receipt over the life cycle. And this is what insurance-based unemployment benefits or pension programs do. So the big Scandinavian unemployment programs, family leave programs, and others have always operated on some assumption about return to work and about the reciprocity among recipients. And I don't think UBI necessarily undercuts this. And as with the wealth tax question, I don't think we want to always think about policy from the premise that we can never kind of build support, because again, it leads to unimaginative approaches. But when we look cross-nationally at unconditional universal benefits, when we look cross-nationally, we have to ask whether unconditional and universal benefits of the magnitude that a really generous UBI would constitute would maintain the kind of mass political support necessary to maintain it. And I think there's two forms of vulnerability that I really worry about in that regard. The first is that a UBI would not be pitched at a generous enough level to maintain middle-class support in the long run, and it would be extremely vulnerable to long-run cutbacks and withering it through a failure to update it. And the result would be a much more meager set of social protections than we currently have. The second concern is that is about immigrants and the boundaries of who is included and who is not included. So when we draw new types of boundaries around, for instance, a UBI, Oh, okay. We have this question about where the scope of social solidarity begins and ends. And is this better than the current system that we have? So this brings me to the third financing mechanism, and this is the one that worries me, and has already come up many times, which is cutting existing benefits. Most UBI proposals involve calls to replace existing social supports with new benefits. And in meager welfare states like the United States, it may be possible to create a model where you expand the UBI and cut existing benefits without making anyone a short-term loser in terms of distribution. But in larger or more extensive welfare states, it's very likely that there will be a trade-off, as Anke just mentioned in her talk about funding a UBI and other forms of existing programs, both transfer programs like generous unemployment insurance that moves up the income distribution, or social services. And again, my big worry is that we cut programs that already have a role in redistributing resources and in supporting workers in the labor market, and replace it with a much more politically vulnerable set of benefits that will do less, both distributively and politically. And then finally, it may be possible to just create a smaller UBI. And Alfie mentioned this at the end of his talk about a kind of a guaranteed minimum income, in which there's some form of taxing back of the benefits or take it from the other side, a transfer that guarantees a floor. And I think that this might be both normatively desirable and politically sustainable, but there are some of the well-known problems that have to do with disincentives created by large effective marginal tax rates for those at the low end that these kinds of proposals engender. And I also think that that this isn't a sort of radical rethinking, but one that really builds on what we have, and that may be a very good thing. To move towards a sort of a less meager, less conditional, a reduction of surveillance and so on. But in order to really achieve the aims, I think that the UBI wants, it would need to be paired with other kinds of programs. So just in my last 10 seconds or so, I think why not return to a discussion of some of the advantages of traditional social insurance programs, policies that support worker bargaining power through labor market institutions, that address differentiated needs, that create reciprocity that extends up into middle-class taxpayers, and that supports people of all skill levels to weather the business cycle in a fair and just way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was yeah, really useful. So thank you all of you for a great introduction, which is giving lots and lots of interesting questions. One thing if somebody could first of all just say what the difference is between the minimum income guarantee and a universal basic income. And I'm going to read out a longer question here from Martin, who says, I believe that COVID-19 has laid bare the holes in our welfare state system to support the sick, and now the perhaps temporarily unemployed. I am thus in favour of a new simple basic minimum pay guarantee for all individuals. I'm not keen on that being universal. I would be interested in the views of the experts on why universal and not a minimum guarantee. Carys, would you like to answer that first?
Sure, and I'll answer the second question actually, because Alfie's done extensive work on the minimum income guarantee and can maybe set that out. But in terms of that kind of why universalism question, well, firstly, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I'm slightly skeptical that UBI is the answer, but I do believe that universalism has an important part to play in our welfare system. And the reasons for that, one is this question of kind of the politics of this. So who feels brought into the system, who receives it. If you look at payments like child benefit and actually the new relatively new pension system, they actually command relatively higher support compared to the more means tested elements of our social security system. So there is a strong argument there that when universal payments speak to kind of values or people's direct interests, that they do actually command support. There's another important reason for universalism, though, which is that the more complex you make the kind of barrier to accessing payments, the more likely you are to miss people. So, for instance, with the kind of what we've seen in the last year, there's probably quite a few people who will have missed out on accessing benefit payments because they didn't know how to apply, or because they actually didn't meet certain conditions, or they weren't sure. And so universalism, you know you're going to get there. And so that's one of the reasons I think Alfie was referring to potentially setting up some form of universal payments, and then when you need to get cash to people quickly, you have a very simple way of doing it. So those are the arguments in favour of universalism. There are obviously drawbacks, which we've discussed, in terms of whether that's affordable, and some other concerns that have already been made in the comments.
Alfie, would you like to mention something also on the minimum income guarantee?
Sure, yeah, I mean, part of the problem with these debates is that minimum income guarantee and universal basic income are so broad that they often describe not only very wide sets of proposals, but also overlapping proposals as well. And I think within each, you'll have proponents of these different systems talk about schemes. So there are multiple UBI schemes, which are all UBI, and there are multiple minimum income guarantee schemes. But I think stepping back, the key thing that the distinction that I would draw upon is that a minimum income guarantee is saying that the key goal of policy is to ensure that there's a floor below which no one will fall. And the means by which you do that doesn't require you pay that floor to everyone. It can be means sensitive, but the key focus is let's make sure no one falls below that floor. Those are above that floor maybe don't need as much, don't need a cash transfer at the same level. Whereas the different project from UBI is let's make the payment universal. Let's have it as flat as possible. And of course, schemes will vary, and actually there's often some variation in the payment depending on child or pensioner or adult. But nonetheless, the point is let's be much more universal. Let's be much flatter in terms of that payment. And I would agree with many of the things that Carys said. I think that universalism is a really important element, and it can of course be part of your means of having a minimum income floor. I think that if you try and build the entire floor out of universal payments, it becomes less desirable than other means. So it's less efficient than a means-tested system. It also means you're absorbing capacity in the economy, you're taking up opportunity costs to invest in things like public services as well. I would also want to speak to one further point, which Jane raised, which is a really good one, which is around one of the problems with minimum income guarantee, but particularly if you have a bit of a universal payment in there, but then obviously a means-tested system on top, is you do come across problems around effective tax rates as people move from unemployment, where they have a really strong income floor, into work. But actually, these can be solved through policy design, and we've shown how, in particular in the UK, you can flatten what's called the taper rate, which is the rate at which benefits get withdrawn for every additional pound, such that it entirely offsets the extra tax burden from paying for the universal payment that sits within the minimum income guarantee. So yes, there are challenges to policy design, but they're not insurmountable. They're not beyond resolving.
Thank you. Anke, would you like to add anything to that discussion?
Yes, I would like to say something about the universalism and the insurance character, which Jane talked about. And what we know from really decades of welfare state research is that insurance schemes are much less vulnerable politically, but also much less vulnerable financially. And because they are based on a contract between the people who pay into insurance scheme and then the claim they make towards the insurance once they need it. So unemployment insurance, if it really works as an insurance, is based on your contributions. But once you paid in contributions, you also hold a legal right vis-a-vis the government or the state that they will pay out a certain amount of unemployment benefits, and that makes it harder to change. So if new governments come in and they want to cut welfare spending and they want to trim the welfare state, it is much harder if you're in a system which is based on insurances, because people hold legal claims towards the system. And it's also politically it is much more attractive to people, and people sort of buy into these schemes much more because they see the reciprocity of the system, that they say, I paid in and and I get something out, and I immediately intuitively understand the insurance mechanism. Universal systems are much more based on a much broader understanding of solidarity within society. And while at a sort of normative level, this much makes it also more attractive. So, you know, it appeals to many more people to say we have to live and we want to live in a society which is has a solidaristic understanding that we help each other out, and the richer help the poorer. But then you immediately get into a discussion of sort of definitions of who is rich, who is poor, who should be paying in, which group should be the beneficiary, and which group should be paying out. And that is much more complicated politically, because then this is part of the electoral competition game then, that some, you know, political parties make use of that and say, you know, we're happy to pay this part of the poor, the deserving poor, and we are not happy to pay for other part of the poorer parts of society, because these are they don't deserve our solidarity. And then we demand some kind of willingness to participate, some kind of willingness to contribute, etc., etc. So the whole sort of the appeal of a universal system on the one hand makes it also politically much more vulnerable. And I think that is the trade-off we really have to address, because that is what will happen as soon, and I'm pretty sure as soon as we talk about UBI seriously in a political way, so that we have a political party that says, you know, when we run for election next time, we want to offer a UBI to society at large, we will get into a much nastier political debate about, you know, do we talk about serving poor, deserving poor, etc. So it will be more divisive. That is my big worry about the UBI. Once we take it seriously, it will divide and polarize societies much more than it will unify them. So I would be on Jane's side. Yeah, I'll shut up in a moment. So I would support Jane in saying, you know, we should look at older models of social insurance, because they're more robust and they're also politically much more feasible.
Yes, and in the UK we've had this big sort of push of, you know, the people on benefits are scroungers, which you know, and I think actually COVID is going to change that, because there are going to be many perhaps millions of people who are not scroungers who need some help now. Jane, would you like to quickly add anything to that, or shall we move on to another question?
Just very quickly to just follow up on something Alfie said, which is, I think, and Anke, which is, I think that often behind terms like the UBI or just any of these, there are a variety of different policies, and sometimes in the political discussion there is this kind of there is this sort of, I think, a slippage in which kind of all good things or all bad things go together, depending on which side you line up against the concept of a UBI or a minimum income and so on. But as is the case in most policies, the devil is in the details, like how it works distributively and who it goes to and how expensive it is really matters on how the policy is designed. And so to come to Anke's point is, when you ask people in surveys, do you like this idea or not? They may be answering that with very different notions of exactly how this is going to work. When it comes to kind of looking at what do we think a fair social welfare system would look like, or what do we think a fair system of reciprocity in society would look like, people might actually have quite different ideas. So when this is very anecdotal, but when I talk to people, friends about a UBI, they often assume, oh no, if you earn money, of course you'll have it 100% tax back. Like it's not for people who are earning. You're like, no, actually for some proponents it is. Like, but there's a lot of slippage in how people understand this concept of universality and how far they are to extend it. So I think when we're thinking about what we want to be universal, I think there's values that we can share, like not, you know, a degree of good quality of life, not treating the lowest income people in society to the kind of surveillance that people who are in the upper income brackets would really balk at, and so on. Those are maybe, and then the question is like, how do we get policy that gets us there in a way I think that's fair and that can build support.
Thank you. There are two questions here. I'm getting back to paying for, I guess, the welfare state, but UBI in particular. How will we fund it? And should no, hang on, where are we? Addressing can the panel address UBI in the context of modern monetary theory? So last night we had a keynote speech from Stephanie Kelson, saying it doesn't matter, the government having absolutely massive debt. This morning in the panel, we had Jeff Crocker, who was saying, well, actually, governments could spend sovereign money into the system, or helicopter money, if you like. We could just be giving people this money, and that would all work. So that both of those points of view are saying that you don't necessarily have to tax to raise this money. Perhaps Alfie, would you like to start on this one?
Sure. Yeah. So I think rather than get bogged down into the specifics of different schools of thought around macroeconomics and who said what first and exactly what different schools are saying, I think I would probably point to it's a really fundamental distinction that helps us to navigate the debate. So it's a distinction between financing something and funding something. Financing, okay, is effectively the idea that you can do the monetary transaction. It is possible to make the transaction, and to that extent, it is possible to finance anything within your own sovereign currency. The Bank of England can create that currency. It can create it in the form of reserves, and it can hand it out to banks, or it can throw it out helicopters, or it can use it to fund the social security system. So financing is possible, whatever your economic context. And it's a really important observation because it shows us we don't have to borrow in order to generate the cash in order to transfer. Funding something is different. Funding something has to involve creating economic value. And so if you imagine a world in which all resources in an economy are already used up, if you increase financing stuff, then you're not increasing value, you're just creating the amount of means for people to transact. And you'll end up seeing the currency either depreciate or inflation rise, but effectively value will remain constant, and you're financing things, but you're not creating any new value. But of course, if you haven't got much capacity in the economy, perhaps you've got lots of unemployed people, or perhaps you've got lots of savings that need to be invested, or lots of raw resources that need utilizing, then you can fund things because there's lots of capacity to be used up. And therefore, at that point in time, when you finance something, you're likely to be creating value as well. So what does that all mean, that conceptual distinction for this current debate? Well, I think it all comes down to timing. Right now, there is no effective constraint on government borrowing, and that's both from a financing point of view, because we have our own independent currency, but also from a funding point of view. We have a lot of lost demand in the economy. We're likely to have many people unemployed and incomes depressed. So right now, you could fund a UBI or any social security system through either increasing borrowing or, in fact, through sovereign money creation. But at some point, you will reach a frontier where you start financing something rather than funding it, and you'll need to look at making sure that you're not seeing that offset in some other way, either higher inflation or higher interest rates or a collapsing currency. And that's where tax comes in. It's a way of controlling the distributional effects of an overheating economy. So rather than just letting inflation just hit people's incomes indiscriminately, you can target it at the people who want to contribute more in terms of sharing the burden of that slowing down of the economy. So, for example, taxing wealth or taxing high incomes.
Thank you, Alfie. That's really helpful. Now, I'm afraid we're absolutely running out of time. Just sort of, I don't know if each of you would like to just sort of say, a sentence in summing up, but really, sort of a few seconds. That would be great. Carys.
Thanks. Really interesting discussion and so much to get our teeth into there. I think one of the observations for me is the distinction about what a UBI is trying to achieve. So I was interested in some of the comments about this being disconnected from welfare. I don't think we can see it as disconnected from welfare, and it's a sign of how far we've come in terms of demonising our welfare system that we do. So I don't think UBI is necessarily the answer to our questions that are plaguing our welfare system. I think there are some interesting kind of fiscal policy dimensions to it that we haven't had time to explore. Yeah, very interesting discussion. Thanks.
Jane, just a few seconds, please.
Thank you all. I would agree. I mean, I think that that we need fresh thinking, and that the debate about the UBI is focusing us, I think, on some of the things that are profoundly wrong with the current system. But whether it offers a way out of those, or whether there's a way that we can take some of the strengths of the UBI, but without sort of treating it like it's a panacea for all of these problems, without investing in other components of public infrastructure or services, that's what would worry me. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anke?
Yes, I think the UBI is not the way to go. I think the way to go is really to look at more older concepts of welfare, the welfare state, and in particular social insurance. I think social insurance, even though it sounds sort of very old-fashioned, is a much more robust way of providing assistance to everyone. So and also on top of social insurance, I think we have to look at universal services. So if we were talking about universalism, I think universal services, health services, education services, care for the elderly, care for the handicapped, etc., services need to be universal. But when we talk about incomes, we can much more look at social insurance, insurance-based social assistance. So that would be my plea. Thank you. But thank you very much for inviting me. Very interesting.
And Alfie?
Well, just very briefly then, for me, I would say the biggest takeaway from all this is actually the debate around what reform to Social Security is far less important than just doing something on Social Security very, very soon. Because at the moment, the politics of this are such that it's far less about arguing about what is the reform, it's even getting governments to focus on Social Security reform at all. And that hasn't been won yet. So let's start with that.
Mm-hmm. So thank you all very, very much. I think absolutely fascinating discussion. I wish we could carry on because I think there's still lots more good questions that I wasn't able to meet. But yeah, thank you very, very much. And I believe our time is up. Shall I go on speaking? I sort of feel I'm a bit alone here, live on screen. I believe we're going to hear a talk about the Finnish experiment on UBI next.